Hi, this is Richard White again. This time I'm tying a nice, simple dubbed streamer. I think of this one as a V-dub, and you'll see why. It uses dubbing for the body. But like an old VW bug, it is extremely reliable. It is very simple to tie. It catches fish. Keeps a fairly small bead, so it's easy to cast but sinks. And let me demonstrate. So first I have on here a fairly small bead. So this is on a 4/0 hook, but it's only a 3mm bead, enough to sink it and give it a little sense of a head without getting extremely heavy. The thread I'm using is a monofilament thread. This is a Danville Ultrafine, plenty strong enough for what we're doing. Start the thread behind the bead. It's hard to build it up enough to hold the bead in place, so I don't worry too much about it. Bring the thread well back on the fly, just like you would for pretty much any other fly. Trim off the extra. Build a little bit of a base where I'm going to attach the tailing material. And for the tailing material, I have just a little bit left of this. It's a bit of goat hair. I like goat. It's fairly fine. It moves very well in the water. In this case, it's just a small bunch of white goat hair. This is a maybe 2 to 3 times the thickness of the shank of the hook. Excuse me while I clip a little bit off. You can see this is a very well used piece. I'm getting very low on that. As with any material, I'm going to pull out any longer fibers, hold the tips, pull out any excess fluff that I don't need. Now, I prefer to keep this tail from being too long, so I'm going to make the tail about the length of the body. So I get the length, and then I'm going to, excuse me while I go off camera, over the trash can and clip off the excess. Lay the bases on top of the hook shank, 3 turns around, then I'm going to just rotate it slightly so it surrounds the hook shank a little bit more, rather than being all on top. Bind it down, go forward, and come back, which will tend to lock it in place. Now a little bit of flash for the tail, and for the flash I'm using a little bit of Baitfish Emulator. It's designed to be wound on, but you can also just clip off small chunks of it. It has a decent amount of flash. This is going to be olive, so I clip just a bit of that off, roll it in my fingers to smooth it. I want it to be about the same length as the tail. I've got a fiber there that wants to stick out too much, and again I will clip it short, lay that on top, but I want to leave this on top. Bind that down to the top of the shank. Again, baitfish are darker on top than on the bottom, so I want to make sure that stays above the white. Go over it, go forward, go back to lock it in place. And I'm going to end just a little bit in front of where the bases of those were, and now I can start working on tying in the main body of the fly. So I'm going to invert the hook shank, take a little bit of this, it's called Tigofly, basically some product, I think it comes from China, but purchased on the internet, and it's a UV white, so you may be able to see that there's some purple showing up in here. I'm going to take a small bunch of this, and these are moderately long fibers, long enough to use to make a body, but not so long as to make long wings. And I'm going to pluck them out, shorten them a little bit, until I'm sort of happy with just how they look. If they're too long, I'll pluck and then lay them side by side. Then I'm going to lay that on the bottom of the hook shank here, the side that's up right now. A little bit more, sort of about 60% towards the rear, about 40% towards the front. I'm going to pinch it, come over it once, twice, 3, 4 times to hold it in place. And I'm going to go forward just a little bit. So I'm building up the body, but I don't want it to be too thick. Then I'm going to lay this, notice this is the V part, since I've tied it in the middle. Oops, I missed a few fibers there. Then I'm going to take these other fibers, the other ends, and fold them back towards the rear, and a few turns in front, a few turns over, back in front, forward, and back to lock in place. And that's going to start giving me that nice bright belly of the fly. I'll come back to where I tied that in. Now I'm going to get my olive laser dub. Again, a moderately long dubbing fiber. Okay, small piece of that, and do the same thing. I'm going to pluck it out and run it side by side. Pluck it out, lay it with the other, and basically what I'm doing is making sure I don't have any fibers that are much longer than the others. And then I'm going to do on the top here what I did on the bottom. So I'm going to lay this on top, a little bit more towards the rear than towards the front, laying it on the top of the shank, pinch it fairly tightly so we can't go anywhere, several times around to secure it, making sure it's veiling on the top, forward just a little bit more, then fold. Well, I'm going to go another 1 or 2 turns to lay it forward because I don't want this to be a very thick fly. Then I'm going to lay that back, bind it down, come forward of there, go back over it again, and then that will stay in place. And what I'm doing is starting to build up a taper. Now I'm going to move so I'm bring my thread in front of, forward of where I had anything else tied in, and go back to the belly and repeat what I did before. And take a small bunch. This time I'm going to pluck it in such a way to make the fibers seem a little shorter than before as I pluck at them and lay them over. Again, laying a little bit more towards the rear than towards the front. Bind it to the bottom of the hook shank. Go forward a few turns. Fold it back. Bind that, lock that in. Go forward and back to make sure it's locked. That's building up the belly of the fly. Now go back to the back of the fly, and we're basically just rinse and repeat, if you will, here. So I'm going to take a little bit more of the dubbing, of this olive dubbing, and I need a bit more than I have already. And if your dubbing is too long, and this one is starting to feel a little bit longer than I like, I'm going to cut some of the fibers and then mix them back in. That'll allow me to get something that's a little fuller. So again, I'm going to cut them but keep them around and mix them back in, because as I get further forward I want a little thicker body, so I'm going to, but a shorter fiber. Okay, so now I'm going to lay that on top, again a little bit more to the rear than to the front. 1, 2, 3, 4 times around. Come fairly far forward with the thread, because it's probably the last of these I'm going to put on, and then I'm going to bind over. And so we're building up the shape of the body there, getting that nice olive back. And I'm going to now do one more on the belly, a small one. Again, pluck some out, pull out fibers so they're all parallel one to another. They're a little bit too long, so I can trim them shorter on both ends, and then roll them a little bit so they're not all uniform, so I can build that taper. This bunch will go right up against the bead. And I think I want just a tiny bit more on the back because I have a little gap between the bead and the material I already have. So I'm going to take a small bunch, and I know I'm going to have to cut this. So I'm going to hold it between my, see if I can show you how I do this. I'm going to hold it between my fingers and cut it so it goes down onto my table. I'm going to cut that piece into thirds. It's nice and short. I just want a little to fill that top. So I want a nice short section here. I will lay that on. Notice each section as I go forward gets a little shorter than the one behind. But now I'm tying right up against the bead. A few turns to lock that in place. Whip finish. Repeat the whip finish. And then just lay just a little bit of head cement down and pull all of this back so I get the head cement both on the bead and down into the thread without going back onto the body of the fly. Now to give you a sense, now you can come back in, and I have a few flyaway fibers on the bottom here so I can trim those off. And to get a sense of how this fly would look in the water, I'll just wet it slightly so you can see how this will draw out into a minnow-like silhouette. It's a little long back here, so we can trim that to a nice minnow-like silhouette. We can't get the lighting on this just a little bit better. And that is the V-dub streamer. Obviously you could use other dubbing materials. You want fairly moderate length dubbing materials to do this. Very long ones you'd have to cut a lot. Very short ones won't allow you to get that flow back over the body. You can use a shorter dubbing material if you go with a much smaller fly. Same technique will work for very large flies as well, just obviously a longer dubbing material. Now you can always look at these and trim and trim and trim, but very effective. Weight in the front gives you a jigging motion if you like. Instead, you could wrap the body and then bring the dubbing all the way up to the front, both on top and bottom. If you wrap the body with preferably copper wire, I like to avoid the lead when I can. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'd appreciate any comments or questions you might have. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.